Hello, everyone, and welcome to Q Plus EDU 2021. We are so excited for this conversation today. My name is Frederick. My pronouns are they, them. I am Out Youth's Texas Gender and Sexuality Alliance Network Coordinator, and I am here today with y'all to facilitate a chat with non-binary elders. I'm very grateful to be in y'all's presence. For our attendees who are joining us who may be blind or low vision or joining on the phone, I am a white non-binary person with blonde hair pulled back. The sides of my head are shaved. I'm wearing black glasses. I have on like silvery earrings and a white shirt that says "Out and Proud" in rainbow colors. And I am coming to you from Comanche, Tonkawa, Jumanos, and Coahuiltecan land, otherwise known as Austin, Texas. And I am 36 years old, so I have the honor of being the young one on this panel. So I'm super excited to learn from y'all today. So thank you so much for joining us. I will put all the introduction questions and stuff in the chat for y'all. But let's see, let's start with world famous Bob. If you would introduce yourself with your name, pronouns, age, where you're from, and a physical description of yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here. My name is World Famous Bob. It's my legal name, I'm very proud to say. And off stage, I go by just Bob. I live in Austin, Texas. I'm a New Yorker that was born in California that lives in Austin, if that makes sense. And my pronouns are she, him, they. Physical description, I'm white, non-binary, wearing a lavender snakeskin print flowered head turban, midnight blue electric rhinestone drop earrings, face glitter, fake lashes, a pink caftan, and hope for the future. That's my other accessory. I did think of this when I chose my earrings. I was like, yes, I want to describe these. And I am 49 years old. And was there anything else? Sorry.
I think you covered it all.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bob. Mitch.
Hi, everyone. My name's Mitch Schreiber. My pronouns are they, them. I am 52 years old. I too am a New Yorker who has been living in Austin, Texas for about 20 years. And let's see, I am a Caucasian non-binary person. I'm about 5'2". I have very short black hair with a lot of gray speckles. I have very small black plug earrings in right now and a short sleeve collared shirt that's white with maroon designs on it. And I have black reading glasses.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mitch. Shane?
Hi, everyone. I'm Shane Wally. My pronouns are Z, here, here's. I have lived in the state of New York, Ithaca, New York, for 7 years, place I came before, right? We have something in common we may not have realized. Before I came to Austin in 1997. I am non-binary, genderqueer, first identified as living in the gender gray because I came out in 1994. I'm 60 years old. I'm white. I have a cat named Tabby on my lap named Snickers. I have a shaved head, which sometimes people wonder if I'm a cancer survivor, and I'm not. I just like clippers. I have on a blue shirt, and unfortunately I can't see my tie because of Snickers head, but I have a navy blue bow tie that has rainbow owls on it. I think that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, you got it.
All right.
So I will stay with you, Shane, for this next question. So Shane and I have had the pleasure of being in this conversation a number of times talking about labels, and we know that non-binary is a huge umbrella term that can cover all kinds of things. We had a list going: agender, bigender, demigirl, demiboy, nettois, two-spirit, genderqueer, gender fluid, gender flux, fluid flux, and trans, among others. So Shane, you mentioned that when you first came out, you described it as living in the gender gray. So can you talk to us about the labels that you use now and why they feel like home for you?
Yeah, I think I actually often identify, I maybe most often identify as genderqueer. I think, right, that was the first term that I remember hearing that felt congruent with my experience, right? Like, right, we had gender variant, which made me feel like I lived in a petri dish, right? Ooh, look, a gender variant. It was like, no. And then we went, right, gender nonconforming, and then gender queer, and now gender non-binary. So I think I go back and forth between gender queer and gender non-binary, or say I'm gender queer and gender non-binary. Because I think the language evolves a lot. I often talk about the fact that I think we don't like labels, but we like language for our experience. And since we have infinite experiences, we are growing infinite language. Genderqueer just feels the coziest to me, maybe. I think, and again, I think a lot of it has to do with it being the first word I heard that I was like, oh, that's me. And because of that, I stayed with it. I think in the same way that I use Z here, here's as my pronouns, because they're the first ones I heard. And so I stayed with them. Creature of habit, maybe.
Thank you, Shane. Yeah, I also, genderqueer is definitely my preferred term. But when I'm in good company, I'll explain to folks genderqueer, non-binary, and trans, usually in that order. But obviously it depends on who I'm talking to on whether those labels make sense or not. Mitch, what about you? What labels do you use?
Yeah, I resonate with genderqueer as well, but typically when I'm speaking with people, like you said, depending on who it is, I typically will say non-binary or transmasculine, just because I think those terms are a little clearer as the language evolves. People like seem to understand non-binary, but genderqueer does feel a little closer to my heart. Yeah, but I definitely would say under the umbrella of trans.
Thank you, Mitch. Bob, what about you? What labels feel like home for you?
I feels like there's an echo in the Zoom because I really related to what Mitch and Shane had to say. And when, as far as how I identify in a general public way, I would say non-binary, and in a more private way, I would say genderqueer, just because it makes more sense to me. It's a less formal version for me, at least my interpretation. And I also identify as femme. So it's a little bit like genderqueer, non-binary, high femme presenting. Yeah, I guess that would be it. I also just want to say it's Marsha P. Johnson's birthday, and I really want to acknowledge her for being such a revolutionary advocate and figure for so many of us. And when I lived in New York City, I volunteered at Sylvia's place, which was her best friend, in honor of her best friend, Sylvia Rivera. So I just wanted to say happy birthday to her wherever she is.
Oh, thank you for raising that up. I unfortunately didn't have that on my calendar today, but I love knowing that, especially given that our friends at the Texas legislature are really fighting for our trans and non-binary kiddos as we speak. So we'll send all of our warm fuzzies to them. But that also leads to a great point, Bob. I definitely wanted to acknowledge the fact that this is a very white panel of people talking about this experience. And so obviously there are limitations to, the depth and breadth of what we can get into as far as those kinds of things are concerned. But thank you so much. Happy birthday, Marsha, which I've heard, I haven't seen it yet, but I've heard it's a great film. All right. So Mitch, I'm going to start with you on this one. Tell us your coming out story, if you will. When did you first come out? What year was it? How old were you? And how did you figure out that your experience of your gender didn't fit into a binary?
So I'll start with my first coming out story, which was when I came out as a lesbian. And that was in 1990. I was 21. And at that point on, I, sort of just, things just change over time. And at some point, I definitely had different feelings about gender, but the language didn't really exist the way it did back then. So I just always kind of thought, oh, I'm a lesbian. And then I would say probably about 6 years ago, my niece, who was in college, came, we were hanging around at the house, and she said something about cisgender. And so my older sister, who's her mother, was like, do you know what cisgender is? I was like, no. She's like, oh, good, I don't feel that old now. And so she told us, and as she was describing, oh, so you're cis, or you're not binary, or you're trans, and in college they were telling their pronouns, and I was like, huh. And in my head, I'm thinking, I don't think I'm cis, So that's kind of how, in my own mind, I came to the realization, like, there's something else going on here. And as the language evolved and people started talking about pronouns, and I just thought, I think I'm closer to feeling they, them.
I love that. Yeah, the first non-binary person I met in real life, in person, and like knew personally, in talking about her coming out process, said that one of the things that was most apparent for her was just the kinds of thoughts that they were having and the pattern of thoughts that they were noticing. And the phrase that they used has really stuck with me, and it was, these are not cis thoughts. And I've definitely, as I came into my understanding of my gender, definitely had that go through my head a few different times too. These are not cis thoughts. This is not what cis people are thinking about their own gender. So I appreciate when other people give you the language that you're like, oh.
Mm-hmm. Good morning.
Absolutely. Bob, what about you? What was your coming out process like? And when did you first come out? What year? All those same questions.
In 1987, I was 15, and I came out as bisexual in a small farm town in California. And I was told to leave my home. And so I did. And I went and stayed with some friends. And I would think 1988, I was 16 and I moved to Hollywood, and basically my identity didn't fit the term bisexual and my gender identity. So when I was 15, I thought I was supposed to be a man, right? So I thought, oh, okay, I just got put in the wrong body. I just got put into a fertility goddess-like container. It's cool. We can just reverse this. And keep in mind, in the 80s, in a culturally starved place, I didn't really have the language or any examples of happy people who are living their best lives with any language that made me feel anchored in who I was. So my sexuality, I claimed as bisexual, and my identity, I just thought, oh, I'm going to become a man. So I felt trans, but I didn't tell anyone. And then what I actually realized later on, kind of the same thing, when the language was brought to me. I'm a house mother, house of famous, and I love my kids. One of my daughters brought to me the term queer, and I was like, what is queer? Just like everybody else who's been around for a while. And when she described it to me, I was like, oh, okay. Yes. Okay. So that's that. And I think what happened was, I used to identify as a spiritual transsexual, and what that meant was, for me, I felt as if I could change my gender without going under any surgery or hormones. And that, to me, that's like the building blocks of queer, right? But this was in the early 90s, late 80s in California. And I thought, okay, well, I'll just dress how I identify at night, and then I'll go out and drag during the day, and then I'll go out and drag at night. So as a drag performer, there was also that twist to it. And there was a lot of confusion, right? Just a ton of confusion. And it was through the younger people in my life that I love, that love me back, that I was able to have the language, which is really exciting to me. that there's language that can describe how I feel in my gender and my sexuality, that there's language for both of those things right now is very exciting.
That's awesome. And I think that's something, yeah, that we've seen over and over again is that, like Shane said, we, as humans, we tend to want ways to describe our own experiences. And I love that the youth are completely unapologetic about just creating new words if the one that they want doesn't exist. If it doesn't feel right, they're going to figure something else out. And then their gift to the world is that they're sharing those all over the internet with us. So thank electronics for Tumblr. I'm from Modesto, Bob. Can I ask where you're from?
I know Modesto. I grew up on a farm outside of, well, I guess I grew up, I don't know, I think it's a trap, but I was a small person, a small young person outside of Paso Robles, California.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Modesto, I've been there.
You've probably driven through Modesto. Most people don't stop.
Yeah.
Unless you really want almonds. We've got great almonds. The fruit stands are outstanding, but that's pretty much the only claim I can say is a good thing from Modesto. So Shane, tell us your coming out story, if you will. Same questions. How did you figure out that you didn't fit the binary, and what did that process look like for you? What was the timeline?
Yeah, I think I too am going to tell a double coming out story, right? Like, I think they're often so linked for us. I think especially in kind of old school lesbian community, right? So, and Modesto's closest to Yosemite. So that I think is the other way people know it, right? So I'm just going to put a nod for Modesto for that, right? Yeah, so and the year was so it was 1984, and I was working for the international headquarters of my church, where I'd signed a piece of paper saying that if I was a homosexual, I would be fired. I signed that piece of paper in 1982, and in 1984, and I thought I was straight, lonely and straight. And a woman walked into my life, and actually into my department. And she didn't know that she was a lesbian either. And we fell in love. And I will say it is not a good strategy to come out working for the international headquarters of your church where you can be fired. And I was living in Boston, which in 1984 actually had a really vibrant queer community. But I didn't know it, and we couldn't know it because we didn't want to be fired. So fast forward, I moved to California. We've all lived in the same states. Can we just talk about that? I finished school. I dropped out of school, so I went back and finished college. And I finally started coming out. So it took me a long time to come out because of all of that, right? And then I moved to Ithaca, New York. And I was working for the textbook department at Cornell University. And I was also the staff advisor for the LGBT student group. And we brought Leslie Feinberg and Minnie Bruce Pratt to campus. And at the time, I didn't know anything about them. And I thought it was two lesbians coming to talk about their books. And so I think Minnie Bruce was first, and had written a book of poetry that was really a love letter to Leslie. They were partners. And then the next night, Leslie walked out on stage in a flat top and a gray pinstripe double-breasted suit and a shirt and tie and shiny shoes and a wedding band. And I was like, what? Because the thing my mom had always told me was if I didn't kind of conform to gender norms, I wouldn't be successful. And I'm like, okay, here's somebody at Ivy League school who's written a book, right? Who were paying to be a speaker. Mama lied. So, right, like Stone Butch Blues had just come out, so 1994. So Leslie came to the bookstore and did a book signing, and I got to host at the table. So I have a signed copy of Stone Butch with my dead name in it, which is a bit of a bummer. So got to talk to Leslie and Minnie Bruce, and read Stone Butch Blues, and called in sick the next day because I felt like I'd been dumped on my head. and got rid of all of my women's clothes and made a department store in Ithaca very happy because I retooled my wardrobe, and I was very fortunate to have a partner at the time who had economic access to allow me to do that. Drag queens in us in Ithaca were super happy because I have huge feet and they got nice shoes. Right, and again, 1994, like there just wasn't a lot, right? The internet was new and there were these weird bulletin boards, and I was on a chat group, which is what we would call it now, called Boy Chicks, which we would never call a thing now, which ranged from people who identified as kind of butch to trans, and like trying to find my space because I didn't identify as butch and I knew I didn't want to transition, right? And again, I had the good fortune to go to some really early trans conferences. There used to be a conference called the True Spirit Conference in Baltimore. And Leslie Feinberg actually gave the keynote, and that keynote address is in a book. And I stood in line waiting to see Leslie with everybody else, stood in line, waited in line, practicing my little speech, right? Leslie's not super tall, wasn't super tall. Unfortunately, Leslie's passed away. So I get up, right? Leslie looks up at me. I give my speech about how, Leslie changed my life. And at the time, my hair was in a flat top. And Leslie just looked at me and said, "Nice flat top." And I was like, my hair had been blessed by the gender pope. I was so excited, right? And so, so I came out. And again, it's kind of, I used to go to a trans conference called Gender Odyssey. It still happens in Seattle. And I did a workshop 2 years called Finding Peace, Living in the Gender Gray. And it was packed, like 40 people in tears because they'd never had anybody make space for them. And so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Oh, I love it. As long as I've known you, I've never actually like heard your coming out saga. So I really appreciate getting to hear it for the first time. And yeah, it's funny how, just having someone hold that space can be so emotional. I definitely cried the first time I was at a conference when the presenter, who was a cis queer woman, said, "Non-binary people don't owe you androgyny." And I literally just burst into tears and was like, wait, what? I don't? Oh, not that we need anyone's permission, but just hearing it, it was so powerful. Which is a great segue into our next question. So how did the realization or recognition that you don't fit into a binary change how you move through the world? Bob, you look more ready to go.
Do I look ready? I'm an actor. That's my ready face. Well, when I was just hearing you speak about non-binary people don't owe you androgyny, and I felt like crying because that's a really powerful statement. And it's only in the past year or two that I've seen on social media and different things, people declaring that in a way that it's not just me in the corner talking to myself or convincing someone, right? And so I am a performer, and in the performance scene in New York City, I'm always happy to contribute if I can actually do a number at a benefit, and all of us that do numbers create funds raised for somebody to help somebody. It's always just this huge privilege. And so I was performing in a benefit for the Living Colors queer housing development in New York City that Cyndi Lauper is a part of. And these two really, really sweet gay guys, they shared with me later, so I can confirm that, gay guys came up to me and they said, "Oh, Bob, we love you so much. You're our favorite ally." And I was like, wow, okay, like I get it. I get where you're coming from, but I'm not your cool aunt that lets you smoke. I'm actually, an artist in the show. And I just told them, I said, "Oh, thank you so much. I'm really glad you came tonight. I'm not an ally. I'm queer and I'm non-binary. And they're like, oh, okay, we're sorry. Then I had a producer of a queer festival ask me if I could MC as their favorite ally. And I was just like, wow, really? And I get it. When I was coming up, we called people what they presented. So in the early 90s in San Francisco, when I was doing drag, if somebody walked in femme, you're like, hey girl, you know, and if somebody walked in masculine, you did not say, hey girl. So there was just these cultural codes of language, and it wasn't, so I just operated and moved through the world in that way, right? So when I say, hey girl, it's as a gay guy saying, hey girl, it's not as somebody declaring somebody else's gender. It's a cultural thing. And I acknowledge that a lot of gay male culture has been taken from Black women. I want to say that my experience of moving through the world as somebody who's very voluptuous and large, a person of size and a person of curves, it's been it's been a little painful, you know. It's been the feeling often occurs to me that there's something wrong with me, not that there's something that needs to be shifted in the outside world. And as an advocate and as a community organizer and a confidence coach, you know, it's a little embarrassing to admit that, but I think if we don't share our vulnerabilities, then we're wasting people's time.
Thank you for being honoring that and being vulnerable with us. I am definitely a curvy person, femme presenting, and yeah, all kinds of different ways to try to get people to respect our gender. And unfortunately, they don't seem to work very well. Shane, how has, your realization or recognition that you don't fit into the binary changed the way that you move through the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think it maybe it's an adjacent story, right? Is that when I was coming out and going to those early conferences that were mainly people who were on some journey of transition, right? And so I was going to more kind of traditional transgender, and in that time period, we would have said transsexual conferences as a non-binary person. So I was an outsider in an outsider conference, like I was on the outside of the outside. And so I would get asked like, oh, when are you going to transition? And when are you going to be a man? Right. And I'm like, oh, I'm not. Right. Or my partner was like, what is it going to feel like for you to be straight? And she just looked at me like, what does that even mean? And I looked at the person and said, oh, A, I'm not on a path to transition, and B, my identity does not dictate my partner's identity. So let's be really clear about that. So I was also talking about things even within the community that like people weren't talking about. And so there was this big pressure of not being trans enough, right? And having lots of conversations about that. And right. And so now what I'm hearing, right, is like people feel like they're not non-binary enough, right? Like trying to be enough is a thing, right? So there's like that part of it. And then I think the other piece for me was like trying to decide if I was going to have top surgery. Because for me, my chest gave me some safety in bathrooms. Like I use women's bathrooms if I can't find, and it was like, well, what would it mean for me to be flat chested and be in women's space? And right. And how was I going to raise that money? There was that. And so, right, like I had top surgery, came out in 1994, had top surgery in 2006. But the best part was I got to borrow money from my church, that church that made me sign that piece of paper. I had a pension fund and I was able to borrow the money off my pension fund. So for 5 years, my church owned my flat chest until I paid them back. So that was lovely. So I think for me, there's just been this journey of like finding my space and my lane and not letting other people dictate what that lane should be. I also think, right, like again, long ago, longer ago, having top surgery, I also felt at that time meant that I was transitioning, which I wasn't. And like, so trying to navigate, right? And now in the world that we live in, right? People are having top surgery and people will take low T, and right, like there's all kinds of ways that things that people do and still stay or identify in non-binary space, right? And so, if I could roll the clock back, I would have had top surgery a decade before. But I did, you don't know what you don't know. So, I mean, I think for me, like to close a very long story in the circle, right? Like to me, this journey has been meant coming home into myself and my body in a way that I couldn't figure out how to do it. And to also be in a place around my own politics that made sense to me, right? Like, again, I think the pull in the early 90s was very much to be butch. And the kind of some of the politics around butchness didn't make sense for me. There in that time in particular, there was a lot of kind of patronizing and patriarchy and chivalry that got attached to butch in a way that felt bad to me. But I had people say to me, trans people say to me, I don't understand why you don't just identify as butch. And I'm like, because that's not my lane. And they're like, but the lane you're in doesn't exist. I'm like, just wait, the highway's coming. Just wait till the mid 2000s, right? 2000s. So I think, right, yeah, it's about, I think for me, it's about kind of comfort and authenticity and being able to be kind of fully present in myself without as unapologetically as I can. Most days, every once in a while. So many apologies.
I love that. I've seen it in other contexts, but I'm going to paraphrase it. Gender is like Highway 35. Just keep working on it, no matter how inconvenient it is for anybody else. But also to your comment, Shane, about feeling like we're not enough. For the younger folks on here, I know y'all have seen the meme of, if you're trans or non-binary and you think I'm not trans enough or I'm not non-binary enough, that automatically gives you 1,000 experience points. You're automatically like so much further than anybody else. It's one of the stepping stones, unfortunately. Mitch, has that been your experience too? Do these, what they're saying, resonate with you?
Yeah, I resonated a lot with a lot of what both Bob and Shane said, and thank you both for sharing so openly. I think for me, this question might have the shortest answer from me because like what you just said, I feel like it's just ever evolving. Like I opened up a can of worms and it just keeps, it's not empty yet. The worms are coming out, for better, lack of a better explanation. I feel like it changed the way and I navigate through the world because I have we always want to conceptualize things. And, I have a friend who is a trans man, and we were talking one day and he said, we live in a binary world. And it kind of just like, I could feel my heart just like, yeah, like we do. And so it's like being an outlier in your own community almost. And then when you're out in the world and there are people who don't even know what it means to be non-binary, I always get mammed. I always get mammed. And it happened more, I think, after I started identifying as non-binary. So it's just a continual navigation.
So I'm going to skip around in the order here, Mitch, and ask based on that, because I think it's a bigger conversation that we all need to have, is how do you deal with being misgendered? How do you cope?
Yeah, it depends. I usually just don't, honestly, I usually just don't say anything unless it's somebody I know. If it's somebody I know, they at this point have probably heard from myself or my very loving spouse who is very protective and will speak for me if I'm feeling shy about it, which is awesome. But I'll correct them if I know them, and I'll say, oh, I identify as non-binary, my pronouns are they, them. But if it's somebody I don't know, I ignore it. It's often on the phone too, because I have a voice, sounds like a ma'am. But even in person, in a transactional space, I just ignore it typically. And I want to do better than that. I think I'm still trying to figure out what's the best approach for me, because I'm not a confrontational, not that you have to be confrontational, but it's just not my personality to want to sit there and explain it to somebody, even though I think that would be the wise thing to do.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. I get ma'amed and missed all the time. And, I know we're in the South, but it's still uncomfortable. And I also have not figured out how to correct people. But to Bob, something that you were saying earlier was, there wasn't anything about your body necessarily that you were uncomfortable with as far as your gender. It was how other people were perceiving you. And I think I recently learned the term social dysphoria. And I think that explains so much of how, because this flesh prison is fine. It's a flesh prison, whatever. But it's how other people perceive me and choose to interact with me based on how they think that I exist that is bothersome for me. And so, so understanding that dysphoria isn't just one thing, and it isn't just, you have to, surgically alter or hormonally alter, yourself to be able to make this work, was really kind of mind-blowing for me. So Bob, we'll go back to pronouns because that is one of the questions that we have, but you use she, him, and they pronouns. So what does misgendering look like for you, and how do you deal with it?
I feel like I really do identify to she, he, and they. It's not me giving people a get out of jail free card. Like, somebody challenged me a little bit and said, what if people just called you he for the rest of your life? I'm like, oh, I'd be fucking delighted. That'd be great. That'd be great, because that would mean they asked me and they're not being lazy. Right. At the same time, so for me, being misgendered is when people in my community see me as an outsider. That's my misgendering. When people call me an ally, and not to say I'm not an ally to the people in my community, but I'm a member of the community as well. So I feel like that's where I get misgendered, is people, I just remind cute gay boys of their awesome aunt that wore wigs. And I'm like, that's awesome. I love that. And I want to hear more about her, but I'm not her. Yeah.
Thank you, Bob. Shane, how about you? How do you deal with being misgendered? And we'll go back to pronouns. But.
Yeah. I had this, COVID's been interesting, right? Because I haven't been out in public as much, as little as possible. And recently I've been wearing a ball cap because I don't want to burn the top of my head. So if I wear a ball cap, so I'm very aware of what I'm wearing and what that means for how I'm gendered, right? So the past couple of days I've had a ball cap and was wearing a mask, and that I got sirred everywhere I went. And I was like, oh, so this is what a man in Texas looks like. It's a ball cap and a mask, right? I have this brown, dark brown with blue and white plaid, and that shirt I get sirred everywhere I go, right? I'm like, what is it about these particular things, right? So I don't correct people if they're not in my life, right? Like I get paid to train most of the time, and my barista is not going to pay me when I help them understand gender better. So I just don't. The other thing is, like, my safety feels the most compromised if I'm going to make a thing about it, right? Like, if people read me as a woman, as a ma'am, like, my service isn't as good. If people read me as a man, sexism is real, y'all, because I experience it all the time because I get better service, right, when I'm read as a guy. An old white man, like, come on, y'all. Right. And where I worry about my safety or or my service is when people realize they don't know what I am, right? So what often happens to me at a coffee shop is they're going to say, how can I help you today, sir? I'm going to give them my order. They're going to hand me my coffee and say, here's your coffee, ma'am. And I'm like, what did you notice in the 30 seconds between taking my order and right? And do you think I didn't notice that you called me all the things? And right, like I just want my coffee, right? I just want my coffee. So I think I really wish that people, and again, people are always like, well, they do it out of respect. And I'm like, respect has to be from the vantage point of the receiver, not of the vantage point of the giver. So for me, being respected is like, hey, good morning. What are you drinking today? Right? Like, just leave leave the gendering out. And so I think, and that's I think, especially in Texas, and again, especially as somebody who reads as older and male, right? Like, so what I do about it is I vent on Facebook, Twitter, and Friends if I've had a particularly bad misgendered day, right? And then, like, the flip side, and just really quickly, I know I talk too much, and I do. I think the other place, though, is bathrooms, right? Because I am a big believer that if we could end misogyny and patriarchy, being trans and non-binary would be a non-issue. But as long as there is misogyny and patriarchy, then trans people are seen as a threat around, right, all the things, which are not true. But one of the things I find is that if I'm using a women's bathroom, which is what I do if I can't find a single stall bathroom, is that I'm going to go out of my way to behave in a way that gets me read, right, as female, which means saying, like, what a beautiful handbag, right? Or nice lipstick, right? Because women talk to each other in bathrooms in ways that I don't think men do. So I think that really my gendering is about my kind of survival. And so I'm not going to do anything that's going to put my safety at risk, even if my physical safety at risk, even if that means my mental health is at risk all the time.
Yeah, I really appreciate that acknowledgement. And I think, yeah, it's definitely something for all of us to keep in mind, because it is a hard thing to balance. So another thing that's hard are names. So how did y'all feel about your given names growing up? And if you changed it, how did you decide what to change it to? I'm going to start with world famous Bob, because that being your legal name is spectacular, and I want to hear the story.
Thank you so much. My dead name I don't use, and occasionally people will really hound me, come on, what's your real name? What's your real name? And I love to do this thing, because they're usually just annoying drunk people at the bar I'm performing at. I love to do this thing where I finally let them break me down, and I'm like, okay, but you can't tell anyone. And they're like, all right, I won't. Like, it's Kevin, and I just walk away. The idea of, I changed my name to Bob when I was 15. So I went to school that day, me and my best friend, and we're really into The Cure. Robert Smith from The Cure is why my name is Bob. That's the short story. we found this magazine, this 80s magazine that talked about Robert Smith and Susie Sue, how they used to fight, and she would call him Fat Bob and he would call her Witch Janet, because I guess that's her legal name, Janet. And so me and my best friend at the time, this really sweet gay guy, he was like, "You're Witch Janet and I'm Fat Bob." I'm like, "Okay." And then the next day we showed up at class and I was like, and he's like, "Are you thinking?" But I'm thinking, I'm like, "Yeah, definitely. I'm Fat Bob." He's like, "Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm Witch Janet." So we traded the nicknames of the people, the musicians we admired. And then I was Fat Bob from 15 to 19. I would walk up to people and say, "Hi, my name's Fat Bob." And it was interesting 4 years. And then when I was 19, I realized I'm still a huge Cure fan. And when I was 19, I was so naive. I thought, well, what if I get to meet him? I can't have his nickname, that he'll think I'm lame. So I changed my name to just Bob. "Hey, my name is Bob," dressed almost exactly like him. He wouldn't know. And these were my delusions. And then when I was 25, my drag mother, Jackie B, who I love so much, I was performing at Wigstock. And that was one of my dreams, was to perform at Wigstock as a performer, not as a backup girl, right? There's nothing wrong with backup girls, but that's how I would be viewed so much. And I just wanted to perform. My performance art at Wigstock, and I got to do it. And the first year I got to do it, Jackie walked up to me, and there were these, I don't know if you remember this, Shane Image, they had in bars at one time, they had business card machines, kind of like press penny, but on paper. You could literally design a business card and they would spit them out. Do you remember those? Wow. So she did one, and they had like 7 graphics, right? Really generic. So mine was a diamond and it just said "World Famous Bob." And then it had something on there, my phone number, I think my real number though. And she handed me this stack of business cards backstage. And keep in mind, I just go by Bob this whole time. And I looked at these and I said, "Who's World Famous Bob?" And she smiled and said, "You are. Now go give somebody your card." And I was early on in my performance career, and the truth is always the best, right? So I ran up to another drag queen and I handed them my card and they said, "World famous, huh?" And I smiled and said, "Yeah, I've been to Canada." Yep. And people would say, "Well, what's your real name? Well, what's your real name? Well, what's your real name?" And I was like, you know what? I'm just done. Whenever I'd sign a check, Google it, checkbook. Whenever I would sign a check, it felt like I had stolen somebody's bank account because I had to write my dead name. And when I was just Bob, I didn't think I could legally change my name to one word, like Cher or Madonna. I didn't think I could do that. So when I became World Famous Bob through my drag mother, it gave me a first, middle, and last name. And then 2 of my dear friends split the cost. I did everything myself to keep it somewhat affordable in New York. And they split the cost of any fees I had as a birthday gift to me one year. And I've been World Famous Bob probably over 15 years now.
That is amazing. And it sounds like you have fabulous friends. I read an article the other day about like names that were banned in 35 different countries, and it's, different, like Iceland, you can only name your kid an Icelandic name, and that like you have to pick from an official list in like all these different places. So I was just wondering if you got any flack from the name change people about World and Famous as names.
So my first name is World, my middle name is Famous, my last name is Bob. And when I went with my gay son, Jeff, who's not with us anymore, when I went with him to the courthouse, there's papers you file and notaries and stuff you do, and then you have to appear in court. They took all the name change people and separated them. It was really early in the morning and it was pouring gray outside, and I wore all pink, a pink trench coat, a pink umbrella. I remember I was like so dressed up and ready to become myself, right? So ready to be able to name myself. And they separated me and I said, "Oh no, this isn't good." And Jeff looked at me and smiled and said, "They just separated you because you're pretty." I'm like, that's not what's happening. And secretly hoping, maybe this is just I don't know. And the person who assists the judge, I don't know what their name is, came over to me and said, the judge is inclined to deny your request. And I was like, and I start it's just, I didn't think that could happen because it wasn't like a bad word or anything. You know, if I had like a cuss word maybe, but I thought world famous Bob, it's just who I am. This is who I am. And I'd been Bob since I was 15. It just didn't make sense to me. And my eyes just started filling, right? And Jeff pulls out his phone and he goes, she's Bob in my phone. Look. And I'm like showing them my tattoo with my name. I'm like, I'm Bob. I'm not here to waste anybody's time. I'm just here to have my name. And she leaned in, and I am not kidding you. She said, I don't give a shit. And she walked away. And this was the person probably being paid by my taxes, right? Like this was the judge's assistant. And when she was so aggressive to me, and there was no hostility or aggression coming from me, I was absolutely just knocked over like a tidal wave. I didn't think that could happen. As I'm leaving, I look at the security person, and my lips just quivering and tears start falling down my face. And I asked the person before she walked away, when she said, I don't give a shit, I said, please, please, please reconsider. This really means a lot to me. And I walked out, and the next day, so I called a few of my trans activist friends in New York City, and they're like, oh, we got this. Like, we got this. If this doesn't work out, we've got you. You know, we'll help you go through the process. We'll fight it. We'll get your legal fees paid for. You know, there's just a lot of resources in New York City that are really great. The next day, I was visiting a friend in the hospital. And as I walked out of the hospital, I was with my best friend, Dirty Martini, and I turned my phone back on. I always turn off my phone in hospitals because I'm scared it's going to like ruin somebody's pacemaker. I don't know. I just get nervous about electronics. So I turned my phone back on, and I had a voicemail, and it was them saying, we went ahead and approved your request. But it did feel, again, like somebody just was holding the ground under me, you know, like somebody was just ready to like shake me off of the ground I was standing on. And it did work out. And I'm so happy to, if anybody ever wants to talk about that or contact me, theworldfamousbob.com, you can email me through there. I'm so happy to help people with that process, is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you for sharing. That sounds grueling, and I'm glad it worked out, but that sounds like a really like gut-wrenching experience. Mitch, tell us about your name.
My experience is not nearly as exciting, Bob, but I did have a Robert Smith haircut in college, so there you go. It was also my fave. My name given at birth was Michelle. So my parents used to always, for some reason, tell, not always, but, you know, when I was younger, they said, oh, you know, we didn't know if you were going to be a boy or a girl. And if you were a boy, we were going to name you Mitch. And so when I decided I wanted to change my name, I still haven't changed it legally. I just went the easy route and shortened it and made it the name that my parents said they were going to name me if I was a boy. And there it is. Pretty dry. But I like it.
Yeah, that's what's most important.
And it feels good when people get it right. Yeah.
Shane, how about you?
Yeah, so I have my dead name, which I do not give. It doesn't matter how much you taunt me, I don't tell anybody. Is a particularly girl's name. My voice has always been this voice, right? Like, I haven't taken testosterone when I was little and had blonde hair and blue eyes and looked like a Disney princess. And people would be like, you look amazing. And I'd be like, thank you. And they'd be like, right, like Exorcist child. So ever since I was little, I've been CERD on the phone. And so even before my non-binariness, I would do a lot of work on the phone, and people would be like, thank you, sir, and what's your name? And I'd give my name, and they'd be like, oh, I'm so sorry, man, blah, 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 right? And so I was like, oh, sure. So I guess I'd been out about 2 years, and I was driving with my partner to see a friend, and I turned to her and I'm like, I think I'm going to change my name. She's like, oh, what are you interested in? And I said, I want a single syllable, strong name that doesn't have any baggage, right? Like, you know, you had that person in elementary school and you never want to be that. So so she just started naming, like, and they could be used by either a man or a woman, right? Androgynous name. So she just started clicking off, right, names. And when she hit Shane, I was like, yes, please. And so we went to my friend's house and we got out of the car and I'm like, I'm changing my name to Shane. And I went to work on Monday and said, I'm changing my name to Shane. And my coworkers were like, thank God. Like, we have not, your name hasn't made any sense to us for 2 years, right? So I was living in Ithaca. So I called my parents and I said, I'm changing my name to Shane. And they were like, okay. And they did pretty well, except they would use my dead name when they were talking about me in the past. And we had to have a little conversation about what that meant, right? Fast forward, moved from Ithaca to here, had not changed it legally, had Shane Wally on my resume, but then, right, I got hired by a place that went to HR and said, we don't know if Shane is a man or a woman, but we want to hire them. And I was like, thank you, HR, for telling me that sweet story. So HR had to know my legal name, right, because of documentation, and I swore them to secrecy. And one of them was good about it. And another person hollered my dead name in a public setting as a joke. And within a month, I had gone to the courthouse. I also have a bad courthouse story, right? So I had the means to get a lawyer. So the lawyer and I are standing in front of the judge, and the judge turns to me and says, you're not just going to come back here next week and change it to something else, are you? And I said, no, Your Honor, I've been going by Shane for, over 3 years, and I'm just now at a place where I can legally change it. And he was like, signed off. But I think it has been really helpful for me that, right, like now when I talk on the phone and people saying, what is your name? And I say Shane. If they've been serving me, they just keep doing it and giving me good service. And if they've been mamming to me, they're like, oh, Shane. I haven't met a lot of women named Shane, although there are, right? And we keep going. So, right. And it doesn't hurt that there's a 1950s probably movie by the name of Shane about a man who comes in and fights for justice and then walks away and everybody's sad that he goes, right? I'm like, yes, you're welcome. So that's my story.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, names are weird. So Frederick is my last name. And I just came out to my parents as non-binary last month, like a couple of weeks ago, and told them that I've been going by Frederick at work and with my friends, but it's my last name. So it's kind of weird if I'm asking my family to call me by my last name, even though, weird aside, I don't have the same last name as either of my parents. It's a whole thing. My family tree is a little twisty. But I love my given name so much. I'm super attached to it. The meaning, the sounds, I love my given name, but other people can't separate gender from my given name. And so I made the conscious decision, probably, I want to say in June of last year, to confuse people, because my presentation is traditionally femme and I go by Frederick and my pronouns are they, them. So keep guessing. So let's talk about pronouns. So Shane, you have the traditional non-binary pronouns, see, her, here's. The only traditional thing about you. No, that and your bow ties. So tell us, how did you land on Z here, here's? You talked a little bit about it before.
I love that you call them traditional. Some people might call them archaic. Other people right now, we call them neo-pronouns. I'm like, what? So again, I first heard them at a conference in maybe 1996, right? So they're not new. People were using them on message boards. And I was curious about them and I was like, I can't wrangle one more thing. Fast forward to 2007, I got hired as the education coordinator for the Gender and Sexuality Center at the University of Texas at Austin. And I was like, okay, if I can't use them here, I can't use them anywhere. Now, why I didn't think of that a year earlier when I was working at Out Youth, I don't know. But But I also was in an educational role. So it was like, okay, this is just a good entry to be able to talk about a thing. And at that time in 2007, Z Here Here's, there was actually an article that I found that was like the most common gender neutral pronouns are Z Here Here's, right? And they're just hard for people. They're hard for people, right? So during that time period, they tried to do what they were calling Spivak pronouns, which were am and er. That lasted about 3 months, and people were like, no. It sounded like you had a problem speaking, right? Although people think, right? Yeah, people think people are like, what did you just say? People, so then, right, then people move to they, them, their, and I always lovingly say that that kind of is one of the pronoun wars. But I have stayed, every once in a while I check in with myself and I'm like, do I want to make it easier for others and maybe on myself and go to they, them, their? And I can't do it. I've tried a couple of times and they don't feel right for me, right? Like I've used Z Here Here's for a long time and I want them, like I'm old and I hold historical context. I'm old, it's all right. And so until somebody says like you're ridiculous, which I don't think is going to happen, because you can still find charts and stuff with Z Here Here's on it, and they seem to be making a resurgence in the neo pronoun stuff, which I still can't quite wrap my head around. So that's me. Z Here Here's, and lots of people making mistakes and lots of people asking me questions and lots of people who ask me, why can't you just use they, them, their? And I'm like, there's so much privilege in that statement. So goodbye.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Neo-pronouns are the whole family of learning experiences that we can all go through together. My tip for folks, if you want a place to safely practice pronouns where you're not going to hurt anybody's feelings, is to practice on your pets and your plants, because they don't care. You're not going to hurt their feelings as long as you continue to give them food and water.
If you have kids and they have stuffed animals, or if you're an adult and you have stuffed animals, changing your, because we lovingly talk about our stuffed animals, my friends. Yeah. So that's another great way to, I know a lot of people have kids and they practice pronouns with their stuffed animals.
I love that. Mitch, how did you land on they, them?
I think that I think I have a friend who was using they, them, and I thought, yeah, that kind of resonates with me. And I kind of like the way that people would kind of get their feathers ruffled when they hear singular they. They want to say it's not grammatically correct. And I'm like, yeah, but it is, and then I would give them an example, like, I think we've probably all heard this example, like, oh, if you don't know that somebody left an object somewhere, whose hat is that? They left it on the table, right? So there it is. It's a singular they, and everybody can recognize that. So I kind of thought it was fun to, to get people a little like, that's not correct, and be like, oh, actually it is. Honestly, I'm not sure if I heard it. Okay, so the first time I heard it was from my friend's kid, and they were young and they taught me, which is awesome, because I think the young people are teaching us a lot and they're amazing and they continue to teach us, and it's beautiful. So here's this young kid visiting my house using they, them pronouns, and I'm like, I love this. This is awesome. And then another friend of mine who came out as genderqueer a few years ago was using they, them pronouns. So I just thought, yeah, I think this is the closest to, it for me at that point, not using traditional binary pronouns.
I love that. Yeah, I think I love also that that's been the thread throughout this whole conversation, is that we've all learned so much from people who are younger than us and from, littles. I love that. Also, Mitch, there's a a poem, an internet poem that I saw a few years ago at this point. I think it's roses are red, violets are blue, singular they is older than singular you.
That's perfect.
Yeah, I love it.
I love it.
Bob, talk to us about your pronouns.
Sure. So I have never identified as a cisgendered female person, a woman. And in the 80s and 90s, I identified as male and I went by he or look at her. So when I say her, she's got it, I don't mean it in a cisgendered pronoun way. It's more in a gay guy way, right? And when genderqueer non-binary, when that language was handed to me by my daughter Maeve, who is just a constant source of love and inspiration and support, you know, I thought about it and I was like, because I do use they sometimes, and I was like, oh, I should just go by they. And then I think there's no right answer, you know, there's just people's stories and their experiences. And I also, out of my allegiance, if you will, to being an over the top identified gay male queen of San Francisco in the 90s, felt really emotionally attached to she and him being interchangeable. Look at her, oh, he's out of control, you know, or whatever. And so I maintain those. And I love when, you know, even in Austin, somebody was walking down the street talking to another person about some program I was putting together. They're like, oh yeah, he's really, you know, this or that. And the person who's my friend walking with him said, oh no, it's her. And then they relayed this story back to me. And it's interesting how many times I have to be like, no, they actually did that right. They did that right. You know, it's okay. Like they did that right. And then they look at me kind of confused. I just want to bring up too, Shane, remember, and Mitch, remember caller ID?
Of course.
My dead name got screamed out in a room at a V magazine photo shoot of like all the New York nightlife people. And someone I admire a lot walked in the room and said, hi, blah, 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 and outed my dead name. And I have a very positive disposition. I looked like Exorcist, to continue that thread. I just dagger-eyed them and stormed out of the room. And I was like, never again. So caller ID was a horrible thing. You would just call somebody and your dead name would just pop up on the screen. It was horrible.
That happens to me now if I purchase something online and it comes out through my credit card. So it'll automatically, if I go pick it up, you know, it'll automatically have my birth name on there, and which is making me want to change it legally.
Yeah, it's such a process though. It really is. So that's a good segue again. Thank you, Mitch. Into our next question. We've talked about how hard names are and pronouns and being misgendered. What's the hardest thing about being non-binary? I know, not a fun question, but we need to ask. I don't have any Jeopardy music for us.
I'll start because I think I have an answer. I think it's having people deny that it's possible, right? Like I think when I was doing the trainings at the GSC, right, I did 100 workshops a year, and I would start talking about non-binary or genderqueer, right, identifying as neither male or female. I think it goes back, I think Mitch, you said, right, like it's a binary, right? People are like, it's a binary world. And they're like, they would say to me, you can't do that. And I was like, I have been doing that for 15 years, right? Like, so I think there are these ways that people want to erase, right? Like my lived experience. And I think that like, why don't you just, right? Like, well, why don't you just become a man? Or, yeah, so I think it's the like having to justify your existence is just tiring, right? Like, who are you? What are you? Why are you? Right? Why are you in this space? Right? Like, there's just this kind of constant barrage. I think, right? Like, not leaving my house a lot, right? Like Snickers, good Snickers, right? Like, she does not bar my access to the bathroom, right? But like, I've been locked out of, I think, like, I know we get, I think, you know, when I moved to Texas, I was like, how can we be one of the largest states in the nation and have our legislature only meet every other year? And then I started following the legislature and I was like, thank the goddess, they only meet every other year, right? So I think they're like like the marginalization of the identity on a daily, and never knowing in what places and spaces I go to, like what's gonna happen. Right, and then people are like, oh, it's 2021 and it's all changed and Shane, let it go, right? And I'm like, okay. The other day, we can have a conversation about the fact that I use Amazon. You can private message me and tell me why I shouldn't, and I already know, and convenient. So I had ordered something from Amazon, and I just happened to walk out on my porch when the Amazon delivery person came, and they handed me we did the 6-foot reach, right? Like, we leaned and I got my package. And then he said, and if you ever start a sentence this way, like just, he said, I hope this doesn't offend you. And I was like, oh, yep. I should have just run inside right then. He said, it's not too late for you to find Christ, and the Bible has been really helpful for me, and you seem like a really nice person, and I'm worried that you're not going to go to heaven, right? And I'm like, I'm on the porch of my house helping capitalism. Like, what are you doing right now, right? And as much as I do, right, like, I'm very open and I do workshops on the porch of my house, I just froze, nodded, waved, and kind of went in my house, and then I wrote Amazon quite a letter. But so I think it's like, for me, being queer and genderqueer, it's like the never knowing when you walk out of your house or you're on a phone call what is going to happen. And there's this level of bracing that you don't even realize you're doing. Right, which is the one, right? And then the flip is like, I get to be awesome, and I get to be myself, and I get to be comfortable in my skin. And so it makes all of the nonsense, right? It makes every bit of the nonsense worth it every day.
Rolled the next question up in there, so we'll do that the same way for Mitch and Bob too. So what's the hardest thing about being non-binary, and what's your favorite thing? What's the best thing about being non-binary? We call this game Zoom Chicken.
We're playing Zoom Chicken. I'm consciously making an effort to step back more because I love people so much and I get so excited that I can accidentally take up too much space. And sometimes it's intentional and sometimes it's not. I was really listening to Shane, and I have a lot of loved ones, family that has a similar experience as you. I really want to acknowledge that I have this incredible privilege of operating as a passing cisgendered woman who is tall and white and curvy and super feminine. And that gets me indoors. It also gets me in scary places, but it gets me indoors where if they had a conversation with me, maybe I wouldn't be as welcome. So I like to refer to myself as the Trojan horse of gender. So, right. So I get booked in these shows or these festivals in places that maybe, I just remember in Kentucky, I love Kentucky. And there was this show that I did in Kentucky, and there was a really beautiful young femme, gay Black guy who was our stage kitten, if you will, the person who picked up the clothes after the strippers, the burlesque dancers. And they were dressed up so cute, and their stage name was Panties. So I'm at this sports bar in Bowling Green, Kentucky, right? And I see a gentleman, I'm hoping, in the front row, and it's just like, it's a friendly crowd when I'm out there. And then I bring out panties and I just watch this person do this, like there's veins throbbing on this person's temple. So I like to consider myself like the pat of butter that rubs up against the doorway, and then I invite all my friends through. I'm like, hey, just look at my tits for a minute. Yeah, don't look over there. And then by the time they're hypnotized enough, I can, I can create a safe enough space for, so I used to do that to people would go to beat up my gay male friends when I was a teenager living on the streets, and they'd be like, hey, F word, hey, and they would come over and I would just flash my chest. I would just like pull my boobs out, and they'd just be standing there hypnotized. And I'd be like, run, and that would give us a head start. So I've really used that card a lot to create, hopefully, spaces that give a little bit of padding, so that not only are the people who aren't passing have that protection, but also an opportunity for people who I'm patting the people from to have a change of heart, right? And I can happily say at the end of that show, that person wasn't as tense. And I'm not saying we like changed somebody's mind that night, but he was clapping for everyone and he didn't look upset like he did the first time Panties came out. So I think there's, I acknowledge the privilege I have of walking through a space completely. The only thing I get is harassed for being a woman. And I like to use my privilege to sneak in everybody else.
Bob, I have to imagine that you have many, many more fun stories. Mitch, how about you? What is the hardest thing and what is your favorite thing about being non-binary?
Before I start that, I'm just wondering if Bob's going to write a book.
I'm working on it. I need coaching. I need coaching.
Fantastic. That's awesome. One of the challenges that, I think it's just challenging in general to, be outside of like we've been saying, the binary in a binary world. But I am enrolled in a program right now. I practice Chinese medicine, and I'm in a program. It's a virtual program that it's a doctoral program, and it's been virtual even before the pandemic. And they have I've hit this stumbling block where they won't change my screen name in the Zoom classes, in the classes that are held on Zoom, because it doesn't line up with the name that is on the roster for the instructor. And they won't do it unless my name gets legally changed. So I've circumvented that by talking to the instructor. Like after a few classes, I realized I could talk to the instructor and they will change it for me at the beginning of every class if I remind them. So I have to kind of do this thing. And my sister's in academia, and she sent me this list of, a form that their school is using now. She's at San Diego State. And, people could just fill out this form and hand it in and say, this is my preferred name and pronouns. So if this large university can do this, why can't this small school figure it out? So I'm just, every time I enroll in a class, I have to deal with this again. And it's just, it's not a big deal, but it's just it kind of is a big deal at the same time. Why are we in this place right now where people are figuring this out everywhere? And they're trying to, have classes on inclusivity and webinars on how we can make the world of Chinese medicine more inclusive, because it does tend to be a pretty heavy white American obviously in the US. It's heavily white, and they're trying to really change that but there's really not a whole lot of talk about gender there. So I would say that's currently the little bee in my bonnet, so to speak. But my favorite thing is, just being allowed to be myself, and knowing that really the youth, like we said earlier, they're recognizing it and they're seeing that they can do what they want as well. And they're changing the minds of their parents and the people around them. It's just kind of this back and forth where, we're really just opening ourselves up and being vulnerable and saying, there's no reason that I shouldn't be myself, and love myself and show everybody else they can love themselves.
I love that. And Bob and Shane added in the chat that ACC has that now too, where you can change your name easier, and UT just simplified the process as well.
It's not rocket science, right?
Well, UT had to, the GSC staff had to fight like the Dickens to get it to happen. So, and it just got simplified last week in a way that it isn't as hoopy as it was.
Yeah, thank you.
Make friends with your IT team.
I tried. No, I tried that too. Yeah.
All right, so we have less than 10 minutes left, so I want to encourage our audience, if you have questions for the panel, definitely feel free to drop those in the chat and Q&A. I'm going to roll our last two questions together. What advice do you have for folks tuning in who are questioning their own gender? And what advice do you have for parents, guardians, caregivers of gender expansive, gender creative kiddos? I know that's a lot of questions, but be succinct. We have 8 minutes. Mitch?
Okay, so the first question, what advice do you have for folks who are
questioning their own gender?
I would say, find some good resources as far as books. There's so much online now. If you're into it, there are support groups on social media if you want to connect with other people, if that's your thing. If not, there are definitely, the internet is super helpful now. Like when, we were saying when we were younger, we didn't really have the internet, but we were able to kind of, find the channels through people. But support groups can be helpful. A therapist can be helpful. Finding people who have a similar experience. So going out there and finding other people who are gender expansive in whatever way, having conversations with them. And then as far as kids, I would say this is something that I have been thinking about a lot. And what I realize the most is you really need to listen. I think that we as adults, and I am also a parent, and I always want to sort of impart my wisdom and my experience. And that's, helpful to a point, but I think more so what I'm learning than anything else is listen. Just like say what you have to say, but also be quiet and really listen to what your kid's telling you. Don't think it's just a phase. Don't think it's not real. Pay attention and get yourself help as well. Find other adults who are going through similar experiences. Find other families. Go, meet other parents. Get your kid whatever help they need to be happy and be their true self, because and just love them. Let them know how much you love them. I think that is that would be my most advice.
Awesome. Thank you, Mitch. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A that I'm answering there. One of them is if the session will be recorded and where the video will be available. It'll be available on qplusedu.org sometime in September after we've had a chance to caption it properly. Bob, what advice do you have for folks who are questioning their gender and for caregivers of kiddos who might be gender expansive?
When I was 25 years old, I was on Ricky Lake as a professional nightclub freak, personality, club kid. And I was in the green room, and it was me and my friend Soigné, who's a great artist. We were the professionals, and it was young people, 15, 16 years old, and their parents who didn't understand. So they kind of brought us out as the experts. And I was in the green room with this amazing young person who had made all of their own see-through vinyl rave clothing. I mean, it was just incredible. And they dressed really weird. And the mom was concerned and didn't understand where their kid was coming from. And I said one thing on Ricky Lake, and I'll say it here. You do not have to understand someone to love them. You do not have to understand someone to love them. If you don't understand what your kid is going through and it feels uncomfortable to you, that's okay. You don't have to, people are like, I just don't understand. And that gets in the way of support, right? So I feel like just being a foundation of love and support, even if you don't get it. It's okay if you're a parent and you don't get it. It's okay, right? Eventually, hopefully you'll have more resolution around it and you'll have more clarity around the situation. But just being there and loving, and also kids, like if your parents don't get it, but they're willing to love and support you, wow, that's great, right? If they truly are loving and supporting you, but you're a little frustrated that they don't understand everything, having patience with them too, because if they're in a place where they're genuinely keeping you from harm and loving you and doing the responsible, all the responsibilities of a parent and being a supportive force in your life, have a little patience with them too. I think it goes both ways. Anyone questioning their gender, continue to have that conversation. And there's nobody else that's going to be you. There's no competition for you. You're the only one. So my chosen family saved my life. They absolutely saved my life.
Yeah, we could absolutely do a whole panel just on chosen family, how much they mean to us and how to find them and all those kinds of things. Maybe next year. And one of the questions that we get that kind of ties into this is, well, what if it's just a phase? What if? So what? You right now is all we've got. So love your kids now as they are. Shane, what advice do you have for folks who are questioning their own gender, supporting gender expansive kiddos?
Yeah, I think find community, right? Whether that is trans and non-binary community, or whether that's community that are true allies and are going to be accepting and supportive. But I think having people you can talk to, try things out with, be playful with is super helpful, right? And again, internet, right? Like there are a gazillion videos and a bunch of books, and I think just like learning and being curious and knowing, again, right, like this is what I said in the last one, like the benefits outweigh the scary. The benefits outweigh the scary, right? That should be a t-shirt. The benefits outweigh the scary. So I think there's that, right? And I think like if you need a therapist, great. And you might be able to get that support another way. And this comes from an ex-therapist, right? So it's not that I'm anti-therapy. I have the receipts to show that I have had a lot of therapy. I think it's this interesting thing that we often say when people are coming out, right? Like it's often one of the first things offered, and just like it may or may not be necessary. So there's that. Parents and family, make a safe space for your people, right? So that often means you have to like lovingly fight and advocate, right? Right? It's like you may have to have a conversation with the school, and you may have to have a conversation with the grandparents, if your kids want them to know. And you might have to have a conversation with the neighbors. I think there's this thing, I think one of the things that I've seen change the most, which I'm the most excited about, is an increase in parent support. Still a lot of parents not doing the right thing. And there is an increase in parent support. And I think that for me, that means being curious about what it means, right? So if somebody's like, I don't think I'm in the right body, or I think I want to be a boy, which is what I said to my mom at 10, right? And the response I got was, no, you don't, and we will never speak of that again. That's not the right answer. The right answer is, how cool, why don't we talk about that, right? Like, what does that even mean or look like? When you say boy, how are you spelling it? Is that B-O-I, B-O-Y? Like, what is happening, right? Like, I think just, right, like asking good questions. And then again, what Mitch said is really making sure that you have the support you need and that you have the community you need, right? To learn alongside sometimes your child. Your child knows more than you, right? Your child knows more than you do, especially about this. So, right, find out what they're reading, not in a creepy kind of way, but like, hey, are you reading something that would be helpful for me? Right? Or are you watching stuff that would be helpful for me? Don't go looking up their stuff without their knowing. Don't do that, right? But I think it really is an evolutionary, and I mean that in a Darwin kind of way. It is an evolutionary process, non-binary, right? Like, I think undoing gender and the way we've done it forever is the next thing, right? I was just a little ahead of the curve. So, and world famous Bob as well, right? We were just like this far ahead. So I think, just it is, and you can't fight it because it is here, and it is going to get more and better and more delightful and more fluid and more glitter and nail polish, right? And more buzz cuts and clippers, like more bow ties, like all of it is going to happen. And so you can either get with the program or you can get left behind. And so I vote, like, get with the program and make sure that your child has the safest, most authentic childhood experience that they can have. Even if it is scary as hell for you, it is scarier in some ways for them because they're the ones who are actually doing it every day, right? And this is the other thing that I hope for parents is that I know for my mom, the biggest fear was that she was going to be judged as a bad parent. And if we can get all parents on board, so when we have parents who are supporting LGBTQ kids, that they are then going to be seen as the best parents ever, and then we can get rid of that stigma. So even if you're a parent who doesn't have a gender expansive kid, you can also be supportive of your friends who are parents of gender expansive kids, because that, right, it's going to take all of us blowing gender apart for it to happen.
I love that. I wish that we could continue this conversation for another hour and a half at least, but I definitely want to be respectful of everyone's time. I'm so grateful for y'all being here and sharing your wisdom with me as a baby non-binary human and with our audience. And I would love to invite y'all and our audience members to join us for the rest of Q+ EDU this week. Tomorrow, we have a conversation with the folks in Austin ISD about how to bring Pride Week to your school district. Thursday is Sex Ed Q&A round 2 featuring our partners at Jane's Due Process and the Kind Clinic. And on Friday is our final session for Q+ EDU this year. It is called Call, Email, Lobby, Advocating for the LGBTQIA2+ community with your elected officials. And that will feature our partners at the ACLU of Texas, Texas Freedom Network, the Trans Education Network of Texas, and our special guest, Lindsay Horvath, the mayor of West Hollywood, California. So we're super excited about that one. We'd love for y'all to come back and see us. And yes, this video will be available on the Q+ EDU website in September after we've had a chance for properly captioning it. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening. Take care.
Thank you.